So we're in chapter 13 and we're going on to English history, and it's in the second section, and we'll go on to the third section, and we're going to be talking about England and France and the national history of each one. And we got through some of English history down to the wars with France, and there was the 100-Year War and the War of the Roses. The 100-Year War, 100 years in war with France, between France and England. Just remember, 100-Year War was between France and England, went on that long. And the War of the Roses were between two different families, the white roses and the red roses. And we'll find out what they meant. That was their symbols of two different families that fought over the control of England. Another control issue, huh? Picture of the War of the Roses, picture of the 100 Years' War, and they had their peoples, their knights fighting each other in the midst of both. This is a national war, and this this an international war, and this is a national war, more of a civil war type in England. We're talking about the years 1337 to 1453. In the 14 and 1500s, we're going to be talking about the Reformation. So we're focus on this area in England and France. The 100-Year War was between England and France, thing to know. Edward III, remember we had Edward Longshanks, was most famous of the English kings, very long legs and tall man. And actually, he's, when you think of the kings of England, he's one of them as you think of. Well, his Edward the Third, sorry, clashes with France is his grandson. I was going to say either his grandson. I'll say son, but it's a grandson. And he had English claim to the French land. Remember Aquitaine and Anjou and those areas where England had taken over under Eleanor of Aquitaine and Henry. Well, now France, he wants his own land back, So now we have this continued state of war over the land at first. England wins at first. In fact, we have 100 years. In the first part of the 100 years, England is winning and beating these French kings. The French kings could not even match the English foot soldiers at all. The foot soldiers had long bows and were shooting these bows, and France was totally being defeated. And so England, if it would have won the 100 Years' War, and England would have won, it would have controlled all of France, even today. And we'd have a different France, a different language and a different culture as France was. But we have English possibly winning at first, and these the English winning a couple of the battles, the Battle of Crécy and the Battle of Agincourt. Two battles England won. And so we're thinking, oh, yay, the English are thinking, wow, we got France. We're going to take over France. Well, it didn't happen. Why didn't it happen? We will see. Well, they leave it all to a young girl. And I'm telling this young girl of Joan of Arc, she was probably just barely a teenager, a little more than a teenager, a beautiful girl. But she was a girl that she had been praying, and she had heard heavenly voices, they said. And she said that she was going to be called to lead the French in the 100-Year War to winning these battles. Well, in the meantime, England had been winning all these battles. And so, but she's called the Maid of Orleans because she started leading. And so she went to the king, who was a weak leader in himself, and was the French king was losing out, and the people were very disenchanted. They were very depressed. And you have this girl come in saying, I've heard God. I am the one to lead the army to victory, the French army to victory. Oh my goodness. The king looked and he basically said, okay, go for it. We'll see what happens, huh? So what happens? Joan of Arc stirred up the French patriotism. As she went into war, all these French soldiers who were like losing and had a very little patriotism. They were at the point of, they were so disenchanted they were willing to give up. She instilled and stirred up this patriotism, said if this young girl can lead us, into battle was with her, and they saw her faith. And you saw how she was depending on her dependence on God and who she was, unusual character. So so the basically after we go into Joan of Arc, I don't know if you know what happened to Joan of Arc, but the English had caught her. She ended up being burned at the stake, killed. Joan of Arc was killed, but had definitely stirred up after they're saying that the great leader of Joan of Arc being killed, stirred up them into being the patriotic French. So, the French kings became stronger. Plus, they had gunpowder then, weapons. They came under gunpowder weapons. So after 100 years of fighting, England lost all its land except Calais. And so basically, England became the loser in the 100-Year War. And now they're concentrating now. England would concentrate on becoming a nation, and France would be concentrating on becoming its nation. But I have to say that maybe the French wouldn't have won if Joan of Arc, this young girl, hadn't stirred up French patriotism and had them fight with all of their heart. So let's see what happens. The War of the Roses happens. England, in the midst, it had lost a lot of its land, including Aquitaine, including some of the big areas that they had controlled of France. They lost it to the French coming back and taking over the land that they once had. But in the midst of all this, there was a split of history in the War of the Roses. So the last Plantagenet king, Richard II, 1377 to 1399. Richard lost the throne after the 100-Year War. He was involved in the 100-Year War at that time, and he lost the throne. And now the treasure is empty. After 100-Year War, England has lost. Richard II, he had played the tyrant and basically saying, he was going to do what he wanted. Of course, the people, did not want a tyrant to rule them, especially after losing this war to France. Richard had seized the property of his opponent, Henry, Duke of Lancaster, and basically the Henry, the Duke of Lancaster. So now we have this War of the Roses coming up. We have Henry, Duke of Lancaster, the Lancasters. And then we have Henry rallied the discontented countrymen to depose Richard as king. So he would become king. So we have the overtake of the Plantagenet kings. Richard was taken over by Henry the what? The Fourth. It's important because we have a whole bunch of Henrys. Henry the Fourth, Henry the Fifth, Henry the Sixth, up to Henry the Eighth, So we have these, that Henry was the Duke of Lancaster. And so what happened? We have the Duke of Lancaster now becoming king. Then what happens? Let's go on. The House of Lancaster versus the House of York. This is in England. They're a mess. They're divided. They're having like a civil war of their kings. Who's going to become king? Another one of those deals, huh? The House of Lancaster versus the House of York. The House of Lancaster was the king of England with Henry, and the House of Lancaster's family dynasty represented, right here, the House of Lancaster, the Red Rose. They were the roses, the red roses. The House of Lancaster were red. The last Lancaster king was Henry the Fourth. Henry the Fourth. So we have, Henry the Sixth. Henry the Fourth ruled. Remember, he took over Richard after the 100-Year War, who was a failure and a tyrant, took over. So now we have Henry the Fourth, Henry the Fifth, Henry the Sixth went insane. Of course, you can't have a king that's insane. So he went insane, and so the House of York. The House of York was a noble family, and they were the White Roses. So the White Roses took over and became this noble family. They became under the kings. So now we have the House of Lancaster, Henry VI becoming insane, and the House of York taking over Edward. So we have the Henrys and the Edwards and Richard. Huh? So we have Henry the Fourth and Henry the Fifth and Richard the Third, all of the House of York, all becoming king. So now we have these a problem here, these power struggles going on between the Red Roses and the White Roses, the Lancasters and the York. In 1461, Edward the Duke of York became king. That's when it happened, 1461. The War of the Roses, and it ended in 1485 at this Battle of Bosworth Field. Just think of Bosworth Field, and you'll see two different roses. These families having these knights they hired. They had people their family fighting each other. Two different families fighting over leadership. The growing middle class favored stability and order. And they were growing very tired of these noble families fighting each other. In fact, they didn't want to fight each other, represented these roses anymore. So the War of the Roses just really made the people very upset. Like, why do we have to fight wars for these roses? Crazies. They wanted a strong king. In 1485, Henry VII of the Lancaster dynasty had the battle, and the battle came forth is the Battle of Bosworth Field, and it ended the War of Roses. So the Battle of Bosworth Field was the end of the War of the Roses. And then the whole kit and caboodle weren't Lancasters anymore, and they weren't Yorks anymore, they changed their dynasty to Tudor. So now we have the Lancasters with the Red Roses, remember? And we have the White Roses being the Yorks, and they're fighting and then the end comes, and Henry VII decides he's a Tudor. He became a Tudor from the Tudor family. And so in 1485 to 1509, he unites the Red and White Roses. Guess what he does? He's from the family of Lancaster because he's a Henry, remember? And he says he's a Tudor instead. He changes to Tudor, not to the Lancaster anymore. And he marries a York. So he unites the York and the York family to the Lancaster family. And the War of the Roses turned into one big happy family. What a deal. What a dumb War of the Roses. And the Battle of Bosworth Field. All to come with Henry united them by marrying. It's like Romeo and Juliet getting married. We have Henry marrying a red rose, marrying a white rose. Craziness, huh? English rights. So we're talking about English rights. Common law. Common law was the way they commonly did things, and they set it forth for law, even though it wasn't in writing. Trial by jury, set down by that Magna Carta, remember? A limited monarchy that meant the king didn't have full control. It had a parliament with a representative government as that parliament, right? The parliament, the representative government, limited monarchy, limited kings, trial by jury, common law. These were all seeds of political freedom, right? And the English Bill of Rights, the British document in 1689, protected the rights of Englishmen. It was used as a model for our United States, our Bill of Rights. So the English people had rights, which was precedent from other countries. Most countries, the people had no rights at all. Only the kings and the rulers had rights, but not in England. Or it was set not in England. Even though later on we're going to find some of the English rights were taken away. Okay, let's go through these really quickly. These are the kings we went through. Remember, we started with the Anglo-Saxon rulers, and then so we have Egbert, Ethelwulf, Ethelbald, Ethelbert. Just think of Egg and Ethel, right? Ethel the Red. And then suddenly we have Alfred the Great, the first king, really considered a ruler that was Christian. And under his rule, we had Edward the Elder, Athelstan, Edmund the First, Edward, Edgar the Peaceful, Edgar the Martyr, Ethelred the Unready. These are all under Alfred. We didn't go over a lot of these, but you can see this, and here's some pictures of them if you look at the pictures. This is definitely Alfred the Great. And the last of the Anglo-Saxon rulers, of course we know Alfred was Anglo-Saxon, and then comes in Canute the Danish rule. And under the Danish rule, Canute, we have Harold Hardicanute, it's a good picture of him there, Canute, Edward the Confessor. And Edward Confessor, remember, he died with no heir, so they had to have a fight, and so they had the battle in 1066 of Hastings. Remember, that battle is between who was going to become king, one of those. And so we have Harold Goodwin in 1066, battled for the throne with William of Normandy. Harold, basically horrible Harold, or I shouldn't say horrible, we should say Harold was the loser and William won at the Battle of Hastings. William won. Hope, I say Harold the Hopeless, that's what I call him. Harold the Hopeless, so poor Hope. He didn't have hope with William. And then we have the Norman kings, starting with William the Conqueror, who conquered Harold. And then we have his son, William II, Rufus the Red, called Rufus the Red. Henry I was the Lion of Justice, remember the Charter of Liberties, basically starting the Charter of Liberties, starting the beginnings of the Magna Carta. And then Stephen, onto the Plantagenet kings, the Plantagenet, I always say that wrong, kings, because he had a plant, remember, his grandfather had a plant in his hat. I don't know. That's what they say. 1145 to 1485 were the Plantagenet kings. Henry II, 1145 to 1189, gave name from the broom plant in the hat of his grandfather. Remember that? And this guy is the one that married Eleanor. Remember Eleanor of Aquitaine, that beautiful lady? Then it was married a French king, and now she marries Henry II, the English king. And then during this time, we also have the common law, trial by jury, basically Henry doing penance to church, because basically what happened with Henry, as you recall, there was a murder that happened. His knights murdered the Canterbury, and as they murdered the Canterbury, Henry had to go apologize to the Pope, which he did. So this is the same guy, Henry II. And then we have Richard the Lionheart, and of course that's Eleanor's sweet son that she loved so much. And he was the crusader, and during the time of Robin Hood. And then John of Runnymede was the hated king. He was Eleanor's baby, and he was a very weak king, and he was the one that was going to surrender over all of England to the Pope, which didn't work because he met with the Magna Carta at Runnymede with the nobles. It said, you cannot do this. It's against the law. His son Henry III was a weak king, and then came Edward Longshanks, most memorable king, and also the king that battled with the Scottish. We'll figure that out. And then Edward II was unworthy successor than Longshanks, And then Edward III, he developed the House of Lords and the House of Commons in the Parliament. Yeah. And Edward III was also the one that was involved in the 100-Year War, at least started in the 100-Year War. And then his successor, Richard II, became a tyrant and totally lost England altogether after the 100-Year War, basically being taken over by the Yorks and the Lancasters. So we went into, there's some pictures of them. The House of Lancaster and the House of York. Lancaster's red, York's white, and then came the Tudor that united the red and the white together. So we have Lancaster, where King Henry IV, King Henry V, and then King Henry VI went insane. On to the Yorks. Edward IV, Edward V, and then Richard III. And then came Henry the Seventh. Henry the Seventh, he became the first House of Tudor. Later on, we'll find Henry the Eighth being one of the most famous, his son being one of the most famous rulers of that time, of course. We have Henry the Seventh. He became the House of Tudor, the first Tudor. Remember, we have Lancaster, York, and then he married. He was a Lancaster, really, and he married a York, and so they came one Tudor. And they fought the Battle of Bosworth. These Lancasters and York fought the Battle of Bosworth, and then, of course, he united them by marrying a Lancaster, marrying a York, which is like a Romeo and Juliet story. That's it. So we're going to stop there, and we'll go on in a little bit.